I think this is our last class in this series. Am I correct?
Yeah, you're correct.
Okay. So first of all, that makes me very sad because this has been very fun. Also, I get to see Karen's lovely face. Um, and it's great to be back with you. Today, we're going to try and, hold on, why is my machine making noises? Oh, 1 minute. Okay. Today we're going to try and take a look at, we've spoken about various sides of Rabbi Sacks, which are, we gave an introduction. We spoke about the idea of religious tolerance and the dignity of difference. We've spoken about the politics of hope and morality and his political philosophy. We've spoken about his attitude towards Medina Israel. But what I want to do, I thought for the final shiur was, if Rabbi Sacks wanted to be remembered for anything, it was his relationship with Hashem. I think I mentioned in a previous class that there was this interview on the BBC, Desert Island Discs, what 10 songs would you take to a desert island? And he said that the song that he would like to take more than any other was a song of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Nigun, of Tzama Lecha Nafshi, my soul thirsts for God, Kama Lecha Basari Be'eretz Sia Va'ayif Bli Mayim, and he said, I would love that. If that could be the song that I'd take it, and if that could be my epitaph, that people know that I yearn for God, then that's what I'd like people to say about me. If you ever saw Rabbi Sacks deep in prayer, he was passionate about prayer. He looked really like a very holy man with his talus over his head and wearing his tefillin. He looked like he was really in another stratosphere. I remember him telling us that sometimes he liked not to go to shul, that he'd go and do his daily prayers in his study at the back of his garden. And he said it was just him and God, and that was how he liked more than anything else to pray. I remember another occasion where I heard him in the shul I grew up in Raleigh Close Synagogue, in Hendon Synagogue. And his whole drasha, I think if I'm not mistaken, it was Shabbat Shira, was on the importance of music and the importance of music in prayer, and how that we've got to somehow connect to God, not only through words, and not only through learning, but through music. He was a very spiritual person. And in fact, one of the lovely things that I remember, I'm looking for a siddur here, but I don't see one on my desk, is that, hold on, I'll get his siddur, 1 second. Yes, so there's a bit in Shacharit, in the Birchot HaShachar, in the blessings, just before we say the Shema, in our daily prayers, where we talk about the angels praising God, and we talk about how they, Kulam Ahuvim, Kulam Burim, they're all very, they all go and they praise God. And there's a line there where it says, they all accept, I'll read it in his translation, all accept on themselves one from another, yoke of the kingdom of heaven. And they all sanctify the one who formed them in serene spirit, in pure speech, and with sweet melody. That's the version. And then it says, so they have a, how does he translate it? Pure speech, safa brura, and sweet melody. That is Nusach Ashkenaz. That is the version of prayers which come from the Germanic tradition. However, there is a more Hasidic Nusach, and that is the Nusach Ha'ari and the Nusach Sfard, and they put the comma in a different place. They don't say B'safa Brura Uvnima, comma, Kedusha Kulan Ke'echad. They say B'safa Brura Uvni'ima Kedusha, with a clear language and not with a melodious tune, but with a holy tune. And Rabbi Sacks, I remember him saying That's the version I like. A holy tune. A tune is holy. And it's that spiritual core that I'd like to talk about today. We're going to talk about Talmud Torah, the importance of Torah learning for Rabbi Sacks, the importance of prayer for Rabbi Sacks, and then if we can, we'll go back to something for Shavuot, which a couple of ideas relating to Shavuot, which I think might be, somewhat relevant to what we're doing. So let's, sorry, I'm going to share my sheet and begin with this. Okay, this is from a book, as you can see, which is called Will We Have Jewish Grandchildren? Maybe that speaks for itself. This was a book he wrote in 1994. He became chief rabbi in 1991. I have to say this was always his a big passion of his. He was a rabbi. And I would say, one of the things that I was working as a teacher one day in London in 1991. I was doing my teacher's practice, my teacher's training, and I was teaching in a school called JFS in London. And into the teacher's room came somebody, and he said, "We're clearing out the storeroom, and I found these pamphlets by Rabbi Sacks. Does anybody want them?" These were pamphlets from 1982, when Rabbi Sacks, was still, I don't think it even said PhD. I don't even think he had his doctorate then. And these were pamphlets that Rabbi Sacks had created for the British equivalent of NCSY. In England, it's called study groups, Jewish youth study groups. And he'd written fabulous pamphlets on issues that people really wanted to know about: the Holocaust, the existence of God, why people suffer, all future worlds, the world to come, suffering. He'd written 10 of these lovely pamphlets. Each one was sort of 8 pages long with tips for further reading. And what I want to say about this is that Rabbi Sacks, at his core, saw himself as an educator of young people. That was where he loved being. He paid attention to young people, gave them his attention, and that's what he wanted to be. Just as a footnote, we went back to him in the 90s and we said to him, "Can you republish these? These are amazing. These are tremendous." And he said, "No, I'm not going to republish them, because if I republish them, I'm going to have to totally rewrite them, and I'm not going to rewrite them." And it's actually I've actually got them at home, but it's a shame that they're really fabulous. My point wasn't to boast about my wonderful library. My point was to point out that Rabbi Sacks, at his core, saw himself in many ways as a youth leader and saw himself as an educator. So this book, Will We Have Jewish Grandchildren, goes to the core of Rabbi Sacks's educational self, his educational endeavor. So let's take a look at what he says here, and I'll read together with you. Mark Twain's question remains: all things are mortal but the Jew. What is the secret of his immortality? The answer, I believe, is straightforward. The secret of Jewish continuity is that no people have ever devoted more of its energies to continuity. Descartes' "I think, therefore I am," a Jew would have to say, "I learn, therefore I am." By the way, this is, I'll make a Rabbi Sacks joke on himself, because, as you know, probably, Descartes said it in Latin, right? Cognito ergo sum, right? I think, therefore I am. And Rabbi Sacks always used to joke that Jews like saying incognito ergo sum, right? The Jews always wanted to hide their Jewish identities, right? They wanted to, they wanted to, they didn't want to be part of the club which would accept them. But here, Rabbi Sacks, that was Rabbi Sacks's, if you want, his comical comment on Descartes. But he says here, Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am." As you would have said, "I learn, therefore I am." If there is one leitmotif, one dominant theme linking the various periods of Jewish history, it is the enthronement, what a lovely phrase, of education as the sovereign Jewish value. And one of the most famous verses in the Torah, Moses commands, you should teach these things diligently to your children, speaking of them when you stay up at home or when you travel on the journey, when you lie down and when you rise up. The first psalm describes the happy human being as one who studies Torah day and night. In an astonishing commentary on rabbinic priorities, the fourth stage Rava, seeing another scholar prolonging his prayers when he might have been studying, says, such people forsake eternal life and occupy themselves instead with temporal life. That's a Talmudic passage from Shabbat. And the rabbis say, greater is an illegitimate scholar than an ignorant high priest. The central burning incandescent passion of Jews was study. The citadels were schools. Their religious leaders were sages. The word rabbi doesn't mean priest or holy man, but teacher. Even when they were wrapped by poverty, they ensured their children were educated. In 12th century France, a Christian scholar noted, a Jew, however poor, if he has 10 sons, will put them all to letters, not for gain as the Christians do, but for the understanding of God's law, and not only his sons, but his daughters too. And the result was that Jews knew. They knew who they were and why. They knew their history. They knew their traditions. They knew where they came from and where their heart belongs. They had a sense of identity and pride. They knew Abraham and Moses and Isaiah and Hillel and Akiva and Rashi and Maimonides. But they had studied their words and argued over their meaning. The Torah was their portable homeland for the Jew, and they knew its landscape, its mountains, its valleys, better than they knew the local scenery outside their windows. Jerusalem lay in ruins, but they were familiar with its streets from the prophets and the Talmud, and they walked in the golden city of the mind. This is just stunning stuff, right? Nobody does this better than Rabbi Sacks in the way he writes this. And what I'd really like to share with you is how he takes this further. So let's just take this further with a lovely story from the Talmud. And then I'm not going to read the whole sheet with you, but I'll summarize what he says. He says, the rabbis of Talmud had a way of communicating deep truths in simple language. And they told the following story about King David. He says, David, they once said, was overcome by thoughts of his own mortality and prayed to God to know how long he had to live. God replied that no one is allowed to know when he will die. Then he said, let me know, said David, on what day of the week I will die. And he said, you'll die on Shabbat. As soon as he heard this, King David resolved to spend every Shabbat in uninterrupted study. The appointed day eventually came, and the angel of death was sent to bring David to heaven. But learning did not cease from the mouth of the king, and the angel was unable to lay hold of him. The angel knew he could not return to heaven empty-handed, so he devised a stratagem. It made a rustling noise in a tree in David's garden. The king went out to investigate, started climbing a ladder. The ladder broke, and as David was falling, he paused for a moment from his learning. At that moment, the angel laid hold of him, and King David died. It's a subtle story. On the surface, it's a simple example of Midrash Agadah, one of those legends which the sage fleshed out of the bare bones of the biblical narrative and made them come vividly alive. It is, however, much more than that. The sages were the unique combination of simplicity and depth. We're not talking not about King David, but about themselves and the fate of the Jewish people. So how is Rabbi Sacks going to sort of express this? And Rabbi Sacks is going to give us, and you can see it in the source sheet, in 3 moments of history. Okay, the first was after the first Khurban. I'm not going to read this because I don't want to just read in this class, but he gives us 3 phenomenal moments. And he says, basically, we have the time of the Khurban. 10 of the 12 tribes have gone into exile. The temple has been destroyed. And suddenly we have a moment of grace. King Cyrus allows the Jews to come back. And later on, Ezra comes back. And what does Ezra do? Ezra's confounded by people not keeping Shabbat, intermarrying, and what have you. Sounds almost like our own times. And what does Ezra do? He gathers everybody in the public square or Rosh Hashanah, and we only know one thing that he did with them. He started reading and explaining the Torah. The rabbis say that this was the beginning of Kriyat Torah, public readings, and translating the Torah and explaining the Torah and a mass system of education. And slowly, throughout Second Temple, Jews started becoming educated. The 10 tribes had been lost because they didn't have this tradition. But the small remnant who came back to Yehuda, by the way, it was 100 years pretty much from the time that Jews had come back for the Second Temple until Ezra arrived on the scene. The community was poor, the community was not loyal to its tradition. How did it start getting that, upwards motion? Through the Torah. The second story, the second moment, is after the second Churban, the second calamity. And the second calamity, we all know, the destruction of Jerusalem in the Second Temple, and the famous story about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who is in the siege of Jerusalem, and they smuggle him out in a coffin. And instead of coming to the emperor and asking for something which he could never have, to spare Jerusalem, what he does is he says, Ten li Yavneh v'chol chachameha. Give me Yavneh and all of its scholars. Allow the Torah centers to exist. And it's that same Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai who says, if you have a sapling, something growing in your hands, and somebody says the Messiah has come, plant first. Plant the sapling, because we have to achieve new growth. And this is exactly what he did. He set up, and as Rabbi Sacks beautifully says, he says at this time, you had other sects. The Essenes went out into the desert because they felt that society was too decadent and they had to be pure. The Sadducees said, without the temple, nothing is worthwhile. For the rabbis, once again, they were able to be the Pharisees. For Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, they were able to be flexible, malleable. How did they do this? Through centralizing Torah study, through engaging in that process of turning over the Torah over and over until they reached a stage where they could survive by means of Jewish learning. And the third moment of calamity, says Rabbi Sacks, is in fact the Shoah, of course. And in the Shoah, let's face it, so many communities were decimated, including those central houses of study in Eastern Europe. And what do we find? Others, he says, built Holocaust memorials, conferences, and wrote books about the Holocaust, he says, but there were other communities who decided very simply to rebuild. In fact, they even called their communities the same names as they had before. They called them Mir and Ponovich, Lubavitch, Belz, Ger, right? Now, not in Europe, but in America and in Israel, right? These communities have actually remarkably become the fastest growing segment of the Jewish people and the most robust in terms of keeping their identity. And by the way, Rabbi Sacks was hardly a member of the Haredi community, but he did appreciate that Torah was their powerhouse. And he finishes the passage by saying, so long as their mouths did not desist from study, the angel of death has no power over the Jewish people. So that is why Rabbi Sacks championed Torah learning. That's why Rabbi Sacks' first public organization was actually called Jewish Continuity. And in fact, when I went back to yeshiva after university in England to start my rabbinic studies, the first people who gave me a little bit of money so that I could afford to get back to yeshiva was Rabbi Sacks' organization, Jewish Continuity. Thanks to him, thanks to Simma Weinberg, who gave me that, funding to get me here. And he started fostering young people who would learn. Rabbi Sacks was very proud that during his tenure, the number of children, Jewish children in England, going to Jewish schools had exceeded the 75% mark. And that's remarkable. That not only, and we're not talking about Sunday schools, we're talking about day school, at least at the primary school level, he had a situation where over 75% of British Jewish school children were going to Jewish schools. Where does that happen? So Torah learning, this is the first pillar that I wanted to talk about today in terms of what Rabbi Sacks was trying to do. Okay, so I hope that's we're good with that. The second area that I'd like to share with you is the notion of tefillah, the notion of prayer, And Rabbi Sacks, of course, was very attached to tefillah and made one of his first missions to create the Sacks Koran Sidor, was very interested in both the graphics and, of course, in the translation and commentary. Later on, he initiated a children's Sidor and a school Sidor, and all of these creations are really remarkable. By the way, one of the lovely things he did, I don't know whether you can see, no, you can't, but what he actually did was, as opposed to how it always used to be, that the English was on the left side of the page and the Hebrew on the right, he put the English and Hebrew on the opposite side so that all emerged from the same center. And so you wouldn't lose your place in the Hebrew while you're reading the English. And that was actually a brilliant stroke that he did. He also tried to write out a lot of the more poetic sides of tefillah in almost like poetic type of language. And Rabbi Sacks was a phenomenally structured thinker, as we might expect from a philosopher. So I wanted to share with you two wonderful areas in which he shows the structure of tefillah. So let's take a look. One of them is really one of his favorite themes. I'm going back to the sheet. We're on page 4. Oh, you know what? Never mind. Let's see. The Amida itself, especially on weekday mornings and afternoons, is constructed in a triadic pattern. First, it's said silently by members of the congregation as individuals. Next, it's repeated publicly out loud by the leader. Then it's usually followed by private supplications, also said quietly. As I suggested above, this is a way of reenacting the two modes of spirituality from which prayer derives. The silent Amida recalls the intensely personal prayers of the patriarchs and prophets. The public repetition represents the daily sacrifices offered by the priests in the temple on behalf of all of Israel. And in fact, there's no repetition of the evening Amida because there was no sacrifices at night. Thus, the prayers weave priestly and prophetic, individual and collective voices into a single 3-movement sonata of great depth and resonance. Okay? Rabbi Sacks loved talking about the notion, which wasn't his, but nonetheless, it was something he loved talking about the Franz Rosenzweig triad of creation, revelation, and redemption. Creation, the beginning of time; revelation, the middle of time; and redemption, the future. He loved talking about the fact that the first bracha of Kriyat Shema is Yotzer HaMorot, right? Is the idea of creation, creating the lights. The second bracha is about the choice of Israel, Ahava Rabba Avtanu, you've loved us a great love, and of course, the notion of Torah. Okay, you have given us Torah, we say, and we pray for Bina, Vinu Avarachaman, and we end off with Habocher ba'amo Yisrael bi'ahava, that he chooses the Jewish people in love. The third one is Ga'al Yisrael, is the notion of redemption. So we have those 3 moments in time. By the way, it also is true about our Shabbat davening. On Friday nights, we quote the verse, Vayachulu, which is the verse about creation. That's creation. Then we have, on Shabbat morning, V'shamru B'nai Yisrael et HaShabbat, which is a verse from period of B'nai Yisrael keeping the Shabbat. The period, is from Sefer Shemot, from the Revelation bit of the Torah. And then we have our third section, which is Ata Echad V'Shimcha Echad, you are one and your name is one. And we start talking about the end of days. And we start talking about the future and the redemptive future. Once again, Friday night, creation, Shabbat morning, revelation, Shabbat afternoon, redemption. So he loved these patterns that we have.
Rabbi Israel, I want to make sure, are you seeing the comments or do you want me to read them to you in the chat?
No, I will take a look at the
Do you want me
comments
to
right.
read them to you now, or do you prefer
No,
to?
it's okay. I can see them now.
Okay.
1 minute. I'm just going to look. So this is from Janine. I see the question. Oh, I hear your question here, Janine, is about people who can't afford Jewish education. I will be honest, in England, they were in a much better situation, because in England, they managed to find a way to have Jewish education through state schools. What happens in a lot of schools in England, Janine, is that you get your secular education as long as you accord with the national curriculum. All the secular education and the school itself is paid for by the state, comes out of people's tax money. This is not a very American model, right? And then what people have to do is supplement the Jewish classes, and therefore you manage to bring the cost of Jewish education down much, much lower. But Rabbi Sacks was somebody, if we're talking about Jewish education, who also, really championed other frameworks. Like, he was one of the founders of Limud, which has become an international phenomenon, right? And he supported adult education initiatives, et cetera, et cetera. So I certainly can't comment about, one particular community or another, but okay. But in the meantime, we're talking about prayer, and we've moved on from Torah learning. So if you excuse me, I'm going to go back to what I was relating to. So what I want to talk about is the fact that Rabbi Sacks, in many, many ways, he always saw what was happening in Judaism based on a philosophical underpinning. So as you saw, he says, well, we have the silent Amidah, corresponds to the prayer of the patriarchs, and we have the public Amidah, contributes to is a reflection of temple service. And there's an interplay between them. So the same way here, he's talking about, all the triad of our tefillah as relating on very deep roots. But this notion of the structure of tefillah, he sees in some even more beautiful ways. So I'm going to share, before I share a recording, I'm going to share with you this last thing, which I couldn't possibly say like he does. But let's look at this. This is all from the introduction to his Siddur, which is a masterwork. By the way, both the introduction to his Siddur and the introduction to all of his Mahzorim, each one has stunning essays on the Chagim, just remarkable. I just read the one on Shavuot. It is a masterpiece. I just read the introduction to Sefer Bamidbar on Shabbat, a masterpiece. So look what he says here. We owe to the scientist Benoit Mandelbrot the concept of fractals. The discovery that phenomena in nature often display the same pattern at different levels of magnitude. A single rock looks like a mountain. Crystals, snowflakes, and ferns are made up of elements that have the same shape as the whole. Does that make sense? Yeah, it's almost like an artistry in nature. Fractal geometry is the scientific equivalent of the mystical ability to sense the great in the small. Isn't that lovely? As William Blake says, to see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. And this is what he says. The first of the request prayers in the daily Amidah is a fractal. It represents in miniature the structure of the Amidah as a whole, which is praise, request, and thanks. That's the structure of the Amidah. We start off with praise, then we have 13 blessings of request, then 3 blessings of thank. It begins with praise. That's praise. You favor man with knowledge and teach humanity understanding. It moves to request. Favor us with knowledge, understanding, and insight. And it ends with thanksgiving. Blessed are you, O Lord, the gracious giver of knowledge. You'll find many other fractals in the Siddur. The existence of fractals in the Siddur shows us how profoundly the structures of Jewish spirituality feed back repeatedly into the architectonics of prayer. I don't know, for me, this is Rabbi Sacks at his greatest. And the last one, which I just love, because for me, in certain ways, this image that he's going to give here has really shaped my experience of prayer. Let's take a look at what he says. I'm sorry I'm reading so much today. In a minute, I'll stop reading. I'll start telling stories again. Prayer is a journey that's been described in many ways. According to the mystics, it's a journey through 4 levels of being: action, formation, creation, emanation. And Yaakov Emden worked out an elaborate scheme in which the prayers represent a movement from the outer courtyards of the Holy of Holies of the temple, to the Holy of Holies of the temple in Jerusalem. In other words, moving inwards. According to everyone, the stages of prayer constitute an ascent and a descent, reaching the highest level in the middle in the Shema and the Amidah. The metaphor that to me captures the spirit of prayer more than any other is Jacob's dream, in which, alone at night, fleeing danger and far from home, he saw a ladder stretching from earth to heaven with the angels ascending and descending. He woke and said, "How awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate to heaven." Our sages say this place was Jerusalem. That's a midrashic truth. But there's another meaning, the plain one, no less transfiguring. The verse the Torah uses, Vayifka, means to happen upon, as if by chance. This place was any place in time. Even the dark of a lonely night can be a place of time for prayer. And if we have the strength to dream, and then, awakening, refuse to let go of the dream, then here now, where I stand, can be the gate to heaven. Prayer is a ladder, and we are the angels. Isn't this beautiful? If there was one theme standard through prayers, it is this: ascent, summit, descent. In the verses of prayers, the Psuke de Zimra, we climb from earth to heaven by meditating on creation. Like a Turner or a Monet landscape, the psalm lets see the universe bathed in light. But this light is not the light of beauty, but of holiness. The light the sages say God made on the first day and hid for the righteous in the world to come. Through some of the most magnificent poetry ever written, we see the world as God's masterpiece suffused with his radiance until we reach a crescendo in Psalm 150 with its 13-fold repetition of praise in a mere 37 words. By the time we reach Baruch Hu, we've neared the summits. Now we're an angel with the heavens. The heavens with the angels. We've reached revelation. The divine presence is close, almost tangible. By the way, notice how he's going through creation, revelation. We speak of love in the most hauntingly beautiful of blessings, great love, with its striking phrase, our Father, merciful Father, the merciful, have mercy on us. Now comes the great declaration of faith at the heart of prayer, the Shema, with its passionate profession of the unity of God and the highest of all expressions of love. And then comes the Amidah, supreme heights of prayer, and Kedusha, the mystical experience. And from here, prayer begins its descent. First comes Tachanun, in which we speak privately and intimately to the king, etc., etc., and he goes through. I'm going to just skip to the end. What has prayer achieved? If we've truly prayed, we now know the world did not materialize by chance. A single guiding will directed its apparent randomness. We know this will did not end there, but remains intimately involved with our universe, which he renews daily, and with humanity of which destiny presides. We have climbed the high ladder and have seen, if only dimly, how small some of our worries are. Our emotional landscape has been expanded. We've given range to a whole set of emotion: thanks, praise, love, awe, guilt, repentance, remembrance, hope. And as we leave the synagogue for the world outside, we know that we are not alone, that God is with us, that we need not fear failure, that God forgives, that our hopes are not in vain, that we're here for a purpose, that there is work to do. We're not the same after we have stood in the divine presence as we were before. We have been transformed. We've become, in Lorianic terminology, vessels for God's blessing. We are changed by prayer. I don't know what you think of that, but for me, if that's a description of how Rabbi Sacks prayed, it is just absolutely beautiful. And in order to really appreciate this, I'm going to share with you something else, where a recording which Rabbi Sacks made with an American rabbi whose name is Rabbi Ephraim Goldberg from Boca Raton. And Rabbi Ephraim Goldberg grabbed Rabbi Sacks for an interview one day, and he was at his shul, scholar in residence, and Rabbi Sacks took him aside in his office and in an ad hoc way interviewed him. And he asked him whether he has any trouble praying. And I just want you to listen to Rabbi Sacks's response. So here, I'm going to share. I hope this is going to work. A minute. Okay, let's hope this works.
to disappoint you.
Not at all. That's very. It's very inspiring. When your siddur was released, it revolutionized prayer for many people who found the commentary so uplifting and enlightening. Could you talk for a moment about whether you've ever struggled with concentration, with kavanah in tefillah? Does it come naturally?
I hugely struggled with prayer, hugely. Which is, I did the siddur because we ran out. The chief rabbi bring out a siddur. It's the only thing done really under the aegis of a chief rabbi. It's the official prayer book. That's the one on which the Quran is based, but it's not actually the Quran. And we ran out of copies, so they said, Chief Rabbi, do us a new siddur. And I suddenly realized this is the opportunity I have for trying to work through all the questions. Why do we pray what we pray? What is prayer supposed to do? And I tried to set that all out in the introduction. I would not let go. So I used that opportunity to answer all the questions that I had. And I hope, sometimes the most successful things you do are when you yourself have the question. Sometimes you write something because you have the answer, but sometimes you write something just because you have the question.
So what do you do? What does the Rav do now when you run into a rough patch where you're having trouble connecting, when you feel distant, when it's not flowing, and you don't feel as much the presence of the Almighty?
Well, there's several things you can do. Number one, I try to listen as I'm davening and be surprised by one phrase or one sentence, and it'll just stop me dead, and that will be my meditation for the day. I'll daven on that. It may stay with me for a week. I remember there's a point, we say it every day in Psukei de Zimra, when we say, God creates the cosmos and knows the name of every star. That's God the creator. And then you have Bonei Yerushalayim Hashem Nidchei Yisrael Yechanes. God builds Jerusalem and then gathers the exiles. That's God the shaper of history. But between those two verses, there's a middle verse. In the middle, who heals the brokenhearted and ministers to their wounds. And there is David HaMelech telling us that sometimes healing one person's broken heart is as important as creating a universe or shaping history. You can live off that one sentence for a year, So never try and find kavanah for the whole of prayer, for heaven's sake. It doesn't work like that. One little thing at a time. The second thing is, prayer has to be sung. Prayer, I've said this many times, that when language seeks to break free of the gravitational pull of earth, it modulates from speech to song. And so I spent a lot of time in my chief rabbinate encouraging chazanim to write new liturgical music, to take some of the songs and make the service more participative, to encourage shul choirs. I'm not an expert in music, but I made that a key element. I found the chazanim and I found the choirs, and I gave them what encouragement I could, and we did a lot of musical creativity. I think music actually frees the spirit, and if you ever are short of kavanah, then you have to have the song, the nigun, to daven with. Those are the two best things. And then thirdly, something might just catch you if you create the silence in your soul to listen. I often, when I'm at a critical point in my life, which is pretty much every day, you just listen. Hashem, what are you telling me?
1 minute. Okay, so that's Rabbi Sacks, just off the cuff. When language wants to escape the gravitational pull of the earth, it modulates from words to music. How you come out with a line like that, just at random, when you hear the noise in the background, somebody just pulled you into their office. Okay, well, enough. It's unbelievable. Anyway, you hearing that notion, just don't try and have kavanah for everything. That notion, music. In my last meeting that I had with Rabbi Sacks, I was very fortunate to have lots of meetings with him. And I don't know if I told you this, but when I published a couple of books And for my first book, he gave me a lovely recommendation. And after that, every time I met Rabbi Sacks, he said to me, Alex, where's the second book? You did Malachim Aleph. Where's Malachim Bet? So I pushed me to work on Malachim Bet. And then he actually, once I turned around to him and I said to him, I said, Rabbi Sacks, we don't all get, 2 months off every summer to write a book. So he looks at me like as if he's offended. And he says, first of all, he said, I don't get 2 months off. I take 2 months off. Alex, you've got to make the time. You've got to make the time. You've got to make it a priority. So when I finished my second book, I wrote to Joanna Ben-Orosh, who ran his office as executive director. And I said, I need to send, Rabbi Sacks been asking for this book. I need to send it to him. She goes to me, she says, you're not sending it to him, you're bringing it to him. You don't like, so I said, am I? And she said, yes, you're coming to London and you're bringing him the book. I said, oh, I didn't realize I was doing that. So I guess I'll go and try and figure that one out. So a few months later, I actually found an excuse to come to London for a lecture and a wedding. I went literally for 2 days. And the main reason was to see Rabbi Sacks. And I had half an hour to visit him at like 7 p.m. in his house. He's sitting very relaxed, but still in his stiff, starched white shirt with his double cuffs and the cufflinks. And I asked him I had a list of questions, as I always did. He didn't like my questions. They were all about postmodernism, and he hated postmodernism. So it was a very quick question and answer session. And then there was a silence. And so he says to me, he says, Alex, what have you got to teach me? And I thought to myself, I was silent. Anyway, he says, so he helped me a little. He said, well, what's exciting you at the moment? What teachers are you listening to? So I actually told him about a particular teacher in Israel, Rabbi Dov Zinger, who was working very strongly in the area of experiential prayer, and a book that he'd created called Matkonei Tefillah. And Rabbi Sacks was really mesmerized by this. And I told him that I'd gone to tefillah workshops with Rav Zinger's partner, Rav Dov Froman, and some of the ideas in the workshop. And he's like, but this is amazing. He says to me, I really haven't written enough about prayer. So I said to him, Rabbi Sacks, you wrote the Siddur. So he was laughing and he said to me, no, I haven't written enough about the experience of prayer. The experience of prayer is the core. And I haven't written enough about that. But the very next day I was on my way back to Israel. I came home, turned on my computer, and there was an email from Rabbi Sacks's executive director. What was the name of that book? What was the name of that rabbi? Rabbi Sacks wants to order it. He wants to meet him. Shows you something about his personality. Not only that he said to me, what can you teach me? But also that that he has that ability to follow up and always be voracious for learning. It was quite something. So I want to go into, if we can, because we don't have a lot of time, the last topic which I'd like to deal with today. 1 second, I'm just going to share the link to that behind the bima. Just 1 second. Just share that link in the chat. Otherwise, I'll forget. Here, chat. Let's send this to everyone. Oh gosh, it didn't work. Just 1 second. Okay.
Let me know if I could be helpful.
Yeah, well, I'm sure you can, but okay. There we go. It's in the chat right now. So just copy it and or just do a Google search for Behind the Bima. That's what it's called. Behind the Bima, Jonathan Sacks, and you'll find it there. It's a 25-minute interview, but it's a really lovely one. Really lovely interview. Okay, so let's go into the last topic, which I thought we'd do a little preparation for Shavuot together with Rabbi Sacks, and think a little bit about a couple of themes on Shavuot. And let's open up the sheet again. And here we get onto the last topic I wanted to raise, and this takes us really full circle in terms of what we've done in this course. The first topic that we spoke about with Rabbi Sacks when we spoke about is the integration of Western thought and Jewish thought, which he does so wonderfully and so ably. And one of the key things that I think Rabbi Sacks really champions, which is sometimes seen as very, very different to Judaism. Judaism, the key word in Judaism might be even mitzvah. Mitzvah. A mitzvah means a command. And a command means generally that I don't have my own autonomy. We call ourselves Avdei Hashem, Avodat Hashem. And if we look, we're going to read on Shavuot, the Ten Commandments. Anochi Hashem Elokecha. I am the Lord your God, Asher Hotziticha mi'eretz Mitzrayim mi'beit avadim. I took you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slaves. However, in many ways, we turn from being servants of God to servants of Pharaoh to servants of God. And this is expressed probably in the most succinct form in a verse at the end of Vayikra, chapter 25, where he says, Ki li b'nei Yisrael avadim. You, children of Israel, are my slaves, says God. Asher avadaihem, they're my slaves. Asher hotzeiti otam eretz Yisrael, ani Hashem Elokechem. You used to be slaves to Pharaoh, but now you're slaves to me. And let's read Rabbi Sacks. Before the Exodus, they were avadim. After the Exodus, they were avadim. The only difference is to whom? Before it was to Pharaoh, and thereafter it was to God. On the face of it, it looks like less than freedom and more a mere change of masters. One may be cruel, the other benign, but service or servitude is the opposite of freedom. When does liberty enter the human condition? And he says the Torah's answer consists of three elements. We're going to begin, we're just going to read the first. By the way, this is taken from his introduction to his Shavuot Machzor. First is the principle of consent. And just to say, this idea of consent is something he talks about also in the letter in the scroll. And many other Sfarim, he talks about this idea, I think also in future tense. He said, read the Torah carefully, and we see that God binds himself to make a covenant with the Israelites only if they agree. And I'm going to digress from reading and just say this maybe in a more out-of-the-book way. If you read through the chapter 19, which is the prelude to the Decalogue, to the Ten Commandments, and you read chapter 19, God approaches the people and says, will you be my holy people? Will you accept the Torah? And they say, Na'aseh, we will. If you then read after they have heard the Ten Commandments and they've heard Parashat Mishpatim, which is the detailing of the Ten Commandments, God comes against them and says, will you do this? And they say, yes, we've heard it all, and Na'aseh. And then he approaches them a third time in a covenantal ceremony and says, okay, you're ready to commit? And they say, Na'aseh v'nishma. Usually, Na'aseh v'nishma in the Midrash is seen as an idea that God, they accepted blind. Do you remember that Midrash? Na'aseh, first we'll do, v'nishma, and then we'll hear. And as Rabbi Joan just wrote, right, there's a famous Midrash, which is based on that they stood at the foot of the mountain, and they said they stood on the underside of the mountain, that God held the mountain over their heads and said, if you don't accept the Torah, I'm going to drop it on you. All of that is Midrash. All of that is maybe saying that the occasion was overwhelming, that the people having been, what exactly was going to happen if they don't accept the Torah? They're going to just be left and abandoned in the desert, right? It's not quite free will. Having said that, when you look at the actual text, God actually asks the people for their consent 3 times. And this is what Rabbi Sacks is going to say is so significant. God does not impose his Torah on the people. He asks them over and over. And that's got to say something to us. So he said, read the Torah carefully, and we see that God binds himself to a covenant with the Israelites only if they agree. He tells Moses to make a proposal to the people. God will take them as his Am Segula, his favored people, if and only if They're willingly assent to becoming a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Both before and after revelation at Mount Sinai, the people give their consent. Note the wording. Before revelation, all the people answered as one and said, all that God has spoken, we will do. Afterwards, we read, Moses came and told the people all of God's words and his laws, and the people all responded with a single verse. We will keep every word that God has spoken. He took the book of the covenant and read aloud to the people. They replied, we will do and obey all that God has declared. 3 times, we will keep, na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and obey. And he says, unlike all other covenants in the ancient world, this was not made on behalf of the people by their ruler. Moses isn't empowered to speak on behalf of the Israelites. They all have to be asked. They all have to give their consent. This argues political philosopher Michael Walzer is part of what makes the political structure of the Torah an almost democracy. Note also that God insists on asking the people whether they agree to the covenant and its terms, despite the fact he's rescued them from slavery. And they've already been called themselves in the Song of the Sea, the people you acquired. Implicit in this strong insistence on voluntary agreement is the principle stated in the American Declaration of Independence that no government without the consent of the governed, even when the governor is God himself. The absence of assent is what makes the difference between freedom and slavery. Rabbi Sacks goes on to compare the notion of, in many ways, and he compares the other dimensions, couple of other dimensions of our Kabbalat Torah, to other ancient Near Eastern systems, where generally the gods saw the people as just sort of like preachers who had to obey him. They didn't feel any need to consult or to take seriously, whereas the Torah does this all the time. So I think this is very significant. And for Rabbi Sacks, he always says it, that God is free. God is not like the ancient gods, part of nature, and human beings have to be free. And this is something that Kadosh Baruch Hu wants. Rabbi Sacks really believed very, very strongly. I remember once hearing a shiur by him where he said there aren't 13 principles of faith, there are 14 principles of faith. And the 14th principle is the principle of free will. He actually claimed that the Rambam was very into 14s. There are 14 books in the Rambam's Mishneh Torah. Apparently, even the Rambam was born on the 14th of the month. He was very into this idea that free will, by the way, this is something he got from his teacher, Rav Nachum Rabinovich, who apparently preceded him in this regard. But free will, said Rabbi Sacks, is really at the foundation of the Jewish people. So this is one idea that I wanted to share with you on Erev Shavuot. And the second idea, let's take a look at. And this is a brilliant explanation of the 10 Commandments. The other fundamental question is how to divide the 10 Commandments. Most depictions of the 10 Commandments divide them into 2 because of 2 tablets of stone on which they were engraved. Roughly speaking, the first 5 are about the relationships between humans and God, Ben Adam Lamakom, and the second about the relationship between humans themselves. And now he says there is, however, another way of thinking about numerical structures in the Torah. And once again, we see that Rabbi Sacks is interested in first of all, threes. Rabbi Sacks is interested in architectonics. And let's take a look. He says, the 7 days of creation, for example, are structured as 2 sets of 3, followed by an all-embracing 7th. For example, he says, during the first 3 days, God separates domains, light and dark, that's day 1, upper and lower waters, sea and dry land. During the second 3 days, he filled each one with the appropriate life forms, sun and moon for the light and dark, birds and fish for the sky and the waters, and animal and man for the earth. The 7th day was set apart as holy. He says, likewise, the 10 plagues is 3, 3, 3, and 1. Okay, let's not go into all of that. He says the 10 commandments are not 5 and 5, but they're actually 3, 3, 3, and 1. Let's take a look. The first 3, no gods, no graven images, no taking God's name in vain, define the Jewish people as one nation under God. See, he's like on an attraction to the American Declaration of Independence, obviously. God is our ultimate sovereign. Okay, and so that is so he says the first three commands. Okay, let's just go to this paragraph. The first three commands, though, which the people declare their obedience and loyalty to God above all, establish the single most important principle of a free society, namely that moral limits of power. Without this, the danger, even in democracy, is the tyranny of the majority, against which the best defense is the sovereignty of God. The second three commands, Shabbat, honoring parents, and prohibition of murder, are about the idea of creativeness of life. They establish limits to the idea of autonomy, namely that we are free to do whatever we like so long as it doesn't harm others. Shabbat is the day dedicated to seeing God as creator. Hence, one day in 7, all human hierarchies are suspended for everyone, master, slave, employer, employee. Even domestic animals are free. Honoring parents acknowledges our human creativeness. It tells us that not everything that matters is the result of our choice, chief of which is the fact that we exist at all. Other people's choices matter, not just our own. You shall not murder relates to the central principle of universal Noahide covenant. Murder is not just a crime against man, but a sin against God, in whose image we are. So commands 4 to 7 form the basic jurisprudential principles of Jewish life. They tell us to remember from where we come from if we want to be mindful how we live. The third three, adultery, theft, and bearing false witness, are the basic institution on which society depends. And this is the idea of trust. Marriage is sacred because it's the human bond closest in approximation to the covenant between us and God. Then he says here, the prohibition against theft establishes the integrity of property. When Jefferson defined inalienable rights as those of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, Locke, closer in spirit to the Hebrew Bible, saw them as life, liberty, or possession. Tyrants abuse the property rights of the people. And the assault of slavery against human dignity is that it deprives me of the ownership of the wealth I create, etc., etc. I don't have time. And he says, finally comes the standalone prohibition against envying your neighbor's house, spouse, slave, maid, ox, or donkey, anything belonging to your neighbor. This seems odd if we think of the 10 words as commands, but if we think of them as the basic principles of free society, the greatest challenge of any society is how to contain the universal, inevitable phenomenon of envy. And as he says in the next line, envy lies at the heart of violence. It was envy that led Cain to murder Abel, made Abraham and Isaac fear for their lives because they were married to beautiful women, led Joseph's brother to help him and hate him and sell to slavery. It is envy that leads to adultery, theft, and false testimony, etc., etc. So he says like this, and I'll read the last 2 paragraphs. Envy is the failure to understand the principle of creation as set out in Genesis 1, that everything has its place in the scheme of things. Each of us has our own task and our own blessings, and we each loved and cherished by God. Live by these truths, and there is order. Abandon them, and there is chaos. Nothing is more pointless and destructive than to let someone else's happiness diminish your own, which is what envy is and does. So, as he says, 33 centuries after they were first given, the 10 Commandments remain the simplest, shortest guide to creation and maintenance of a good society. Many alternatives have been tried, and most of them ended in tears. The wise aphorism remains true. When all else fails, read the instructions. What I tried to do today is share with you Rabbi Sacks' readings of the core of our tradition, right? Prayer, Talmud Torah, and the way that he articulates, as only he can, the significance of these things, the way he comes up with novel readings, frequently based on just this phenomenally structured mind of his. And I hope that in general, this course has whet your appetite. You know, as Hillel said to the guy standing on one leg, it's not really fair to take a guy who wrote 30 books and to summarize his teachings in, 6 classes, but we've covered quite a lot. And I hope this has sort of opened up a sense of Rabbi Sacks's world to you and given you a sort of a foothold so that you can pick up any of his books and know what you're going to read a little bit and feel at home in them. So after, from now on, I just need you to put in Amazon.com and order a couple of books and get reading. You've got, 2 days of Shavuot. What else are you going to do? So that's what we've got on the agenda. Thank you very much. I really hope to have lots of future opportunities to learn with each and every one of you. And thank you to Drisha for this fabulous opportunity. Toda Rabba and Chag Sameach.
Do you have a minute for questions or comments or?
I have to run to another.
Oh, no problem. Yes, 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 of course, no problem at
Sorry,
all.
I
Thank you so much,
apologize.
Rabbi Israel, for this wonderful class. Really, really, really loved it.
Simcha rabah.
And thank you,
Thanks for all the comments.
Chag Sameach. And thank you to everyone who joined us. I did say some announcements in the beginning of the class, but I'll mention them again now that our summer programs still have some openings. Adults are welcome to apply. We have the Gemara Seder with Rabbi Dan Margulis. It's in the morning online. You have an option to pick 3-week or 6-week. There's 2 options. And also our girls' summer programs, both middle school and high school, are down to the very last spots, but there's still a few spots available if you have any Talmidon in your life that could join. And just wanted to wish everyone Shavuot Sameach, and I'm looking forward to learning together after the holiday. Lehitraot!